Script. In the polished and vast chamber of the Shalon High Council, tension buzzed like a live wire. Laura, a high-ranking diplomat with skin as blue as starlit oceans, stood tall, her emerald gaze sharp and unyielding. She regarded Owen, a human envoy, with a mixture of disdain and cold curiosity. Humanity's ambition knows no limits, she stated icily, each word sculpted with contempt. It's always reaching, always grasping, usually with disastrous results. What makes you think your kind can bring anything but chaos to our world? Owen met her gaze, unfazed. We call it progress, he said, arching an eyebrow, his voice both calm and unyielding. Pushing boundaries is how we've survived. Without it, we stagnate. She smirked, her disdain cutting sharper than any weapon. Primitive. It's astonishing your species still confuses recklessness with courage. The Shalon survived millennia by valuing restraint over impulsiveness. He leaned in, a challenge glinting in his eyes. Restraint or stagnation, Laura? Perhaps it's time the Shalon learned that progress doesn't have to mean shackling oneself in old beliefs. Her lips tightened as his words struck a nerve, but her retort was lost as the chamber shook violently. The crystalline lights overhead quivered, and a low metallic groan resonated through the walls. Owen tensed, instinctively dropping into a defensive stance. A muffled explosion echoed outside the door, followed by the eerie silence of footsteps, trained, silent, and deliberate. Shadows flitted into the hall as Shalon assassins, their forms shrouded in dark cloaks, materialized, energy blades humming. In a heartbeat, Owen surged forward, placing himself between Laura and the intruders. "Get behind me," he murmured, his tone calm, yet commanding. Laura's pride flared, but she couldn't ignore the threat. Taking a defensive stance beside him, her movements were fluid, precise, and deadly. Together, they fought, a whirlwind of movement and instinct. Owen's training kicked in as he blocked, countered, and struck with ruthless efficiency, while Laura's swift, sinuous strikes hinted at combat skills as deadly as they were elegant. In the aftermath, as the last assassin crumpled, Owen found himself breathing hard, face to face with Laura. Her guarded expression softened just a fraction, and for the first time, he saw something other than disdain in her eyes, respect, and perhaps a flicker of gratitude. "I underestimated you," she said, the words reluctant and unfamiliar on her tongue. He smiled, his adrenaline-fueled pulse slowly settling. "We may not see eye to eye, but that doesn't make you my enemy." She looked away, considering his words with a newfound intensity. "This isn't an alliance," she added softly, but with less finality than before. "Not yet. Perhaps for diplomacy's sake, though we might try again." A subtle thaw in her voice gave him hope. He nodded, hiding his satisfaction. "I'd welcome that, Laura." She met his gaze, her expression unreadable, but her silence somehow promising. "Meet me tomorrow," she said after a moment, "and perhaps we'll find something worth salvaging." The next evening, Owen stood outside her quarters, anticipation coiling in his chest. When the door slid open, he was greeted by the sight of a room draped in starlit hues, silk shimmering in the soft light, and Laura awaiting him, her sapphire skin almost luminous in the dim glow. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice measured but sincere. He inclined his head, stepping forward. "We're here to find common ground." She gestured for him to sit, and he took a seat across from her, carefully holding her gaze. "The Shalon prioritize balance and order," she began, "while humanity thrives on chaos. To us, aligning with you means inviting danger into a place of peace." Owen leaned in, his voice low and steady. "We've made mistakes, yes, but our ambition drives us to grow, to innovate in ways we never expected. Perhaps that same risk could offer something valuable to the Shalon." Her eyes softened, though skepticism lingered. Sometimes restraint brings greater rewards than reckless ambition. "And yet, restraint can hold you back," he countered gently. "Imagine what our people could achieve together, not just as allies, but as true partners." Her gaze turned inward, considering, and for a moment he saw something shift in her, curiosity, a glimmer of what might be a crack in her icy resolve. "You're persistent," she admitted quietly, her tone hinting at respect. "It's admirable." A pause lingered between them, and her lips curved ever so slightly. "But tell me, Owen, why do you believe Shalon would gain from an alliance with humanity?" "Because Earth's diversity and resilience have made us stronger. Our differences, our conflicts, they force us to adapt and grow. Shalon could gain a new perspective by working with us." Her gaze lingered on his face, searching for sincerity. After a long silence, she nodded, though her caution remained intact. "It's an intriguing idea," she murmured. "Then join me tomorrow," he said, a spark of hope rising within him. "There's an observation deck overlooking the nebulae. I'd like to show you a glimpse of what I mean." She hesitated, but curiosity won over caution. "Very well," she agreed, her voice softening. Under the vast canvas of space, they met on the observation deck, the nebulae casting a haunting glow over the chamber. Owen was already there, gazing into the swirling cosmos, when Laura arrived, her dark gown flowing like liquid stardust. She joined him, her voice low, almost reverent. "I can see why you value this view. There's a vastness here I'd forgotten." He turned to her, warmth in his smile. "Sometimes we all need to remember that out here we're all part of something larger." They stood together in silence, the stars around them echoing the unspoken tension that hummed between them. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice barely a whisper. "You challenge me, Owen? More than anyone I've ever met." He looked down, the gravity of her words settling over him. "I've never met anyone like you either." She held his gaze, her guarded walls slowly dissolving. Without a word, she reached out, her cool hand brushing his. He laced his fingers through hers, feeling the tremor that betrayed her vulnerability. "Owen," she began, her voice wavering with a conflict she could no longer hide. He pressed a gentle finger to her lips, smiling. "This doesn't have to mean anything beyond this moment," he whispered. For the first time, Laura allowed herself to smile, a small, hesitant curve of her lips. She looked back out at the stars, letting the silence between them hold what words couldn't. Though their worlds remained far apart, the spark between them felt like the beginning of something neither could deny. In that fleeting, starlit moment, Owen felt a strange certainty. Laura's vow had been broken by something deeper than mere diplomacy. And for the first time, her heart was open to the possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, humanity could bring something more than chaos. The hum of the station at night was a comforting, constant pulse, a heartbeat that Laura had long found soothing. But tonight, a strange and unfamiliar warmth hummed through her instead, unsettling in its softness. She could still feel the ghost of Owen's touch on her fingers, a lingering sensation that refused to fade as she paced the quiet corridors. She'd spent her entire career avoiding unnecessary entanglements, priding herself on her restraint and on the purity of her Shalon heritage. But Owen had a peculiar way of slipping past her defenses, of challenging her principles with an ease that infuriated her, even as it fascinated her. The universe was enormous, she reminded herself, and her sense of duty was even larger. Yet, in one electrifying moment, her resolve had cracked, just enough to let him in. The station was quiet when she finally returned to her quarters. She sat by the viewport, watching the swirling nebula outside, its glowing dust clouds the only movement in the night. But her thoughts lingered on the human envoy's words, on the unfamiliar thrill of their conversation and the silent intensity in his eyes. If she wasn't careful, that thrill could quickly lead her somewhere she had vowed never to go. Shalon pride kept her grounded, yet curiosity threatened to sweep her off course. The next morning, Owen awoke to a summons. Laura had arranged a private meeting in the council gardens, a restricted section of the station reserved only for the Shalon dignitaries. The surprise flickered over him, an unexpected tug of eagerness warming his chest. He wasn't accustomed to feeling this way about an alien, especially one as untouchable as Laura. When he arrived, she was already waiting, standing amid a grove of towering, silver-leaf trees that shimmered with the station's artificial sunlight. She wore a dark, elegant gown that rippled with her every movement, and for a moment, Owen felt as though he were stepping into another world. "You came," she said, her tone formal yet tinged with an unreadable note. Her eyes, sharp and vivid as ever, softened when they met his. "Wouldn't miss it," he replied, trying to sound casual, though the sight of her took his breath away. "This place is something else." She nodded, her gaze sweeping over the tranquil scene, as if she saw it with fresh eyes. The Shalon believe nature in any form, however small, keeps us grounded, connected to the past even in a place as artificial as this station. Owen studied her face, noting the hint of reverence in her voice. "You think it connects you to your history, while I think it's a chance for new growth. Maybe our views aren't as different as they seem." A flicker of amusement crossed her lips. "Perhaps, though I'm not ready to concede our philosophies are compatible." Owen's smile was soft but assured. "It doesn't have to be easy for it to be worth exploring." Her gaze sharpened, her pride bristling, but this time, she softened instead of pushing back. "I never thought I'd say this, Owen, but your persistence is intriguing." The admission surprised him, and he felt himself standing straighter. "I'll take that as a compliment." Before she could reply, a subtle hum sounded from a console nearby. Laura's expression turned wary as she glanced at the incoming message. She tapped a command, and the holographic screen blinked to life, displaying an encrypted transmission. It was an urgent, encoded message from the Shalon Council. Her eyes narrowed as she read the words, her calm exterior barely concealing a spark of worry. "There's been an incident," she murmured, her tone laced with tension. "Another attack?" Owen asked, stepping closer. "Not quite," she replied, her voice low. "A Shalon outpost in the Zerelian sector has gone silent, and early reports suggest a sabotage attempt, one too precise to be accidental. They suspect humans." A bitter look passed over her face, but she seemed to temper it, taking a slow breath before looking at him. "This is the kind of recklessness we've feared, Owen." Owen's face darkened, and his posture shifted as he braced himself for her judgment. "We have factions just like you do. Not everyone acts in alignment with official mandates. But you know me. If this is human sabotage, I'm here to help you find out why." Laura studied him, a trace of hesitation flickering in her expression. "You would stand against your own kind?" He met her gaze steadily, his voice resolute. "If they're endangering lives, yes. This alliance, fragile as it is important to both our worlds. I'm here to protect it, and to protect you." A glimmer of uncertainty passed through her, and then she made a decision. "Then we'll investigate together. My ship departs in 1 hour." Owen joined her in the docking bay, his pulse racing as they boarded her sleek, crystalline vessel. The ship was unlike any human craft, its interior illuminated by a gentle glow that seemed to pulse with its own life. He settled into the co-pilot's chair, his gaze drifting to the intricate Shalon technology surrounding them. "Quite a ship," he murmured, half to himself. Laura glanced at him, her gaze softened by an unspoken pride. "The Vala is one of our most advanced vessels. But it's not merely a machine, it's bonded to its pilot, synchronized to my neural patterns." Owen chuckled. "So, I guess I'm in your hands then." She allowed herself a faint smile. "You're not the first human to say that." As they left the docking bay, the stars opened up around them in a brilliant, endless panorama. The Zerelian sector was remote, rarely traveled even by the Shalon, yet they made swift progress, the Vala gliding effortlessly through the cosmos. The trip passed in a charged silence, both of them acutely aware of the tension that lay just beneath the surface. After hours of quiet, she finally spoke, her voice subdued. "Why do you care so much about bridging our worlds, Owen? Surely there are others who would have taken an easier assignment." He looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe it's because I believe our differences make us stronger. Humanity needs what the Shalon can offer, and I think you need something we can offer too." Laura sighed, the faintest crease of worry lining her brow. "Perhaps. But ambition has led your people into troubling paths before. We've seen it too many times to ignore." Owen's gaze softened. Maybe that's why I'm here, to show you there's more to us than just ambition. There's empathy, respect, connection. Their eyes met, and for a moment, her defenses lowered. Perhaps I'll reserve judgment until I've seen what kind of humanity you're willing to show. Suddenly, the console lights flickered, and a low, ominous tone echoed through the cockpit. "We're here," she said, her tone cold and focused once more. Through the viewport, Owen saw the dim, shadowed silhouette of the Shalon outpost on the edge of a dark planet. The structures were lifeless, the usual lights extinguished, leaving only a faint outline against the swirling, misty clouds of the planet's atmosphere. The Vala touched down gently, and as they disembarked, the eerie silence enveloped them. Laura activated her scanner, searching for any signs of life, while Owen checked the surroundings, his senses on high alert. "Keep close," she murmured, her voice betraying a trace of vulnerability. Together, they moved through the outpost corridors, alert for any sign of movement. Suddenly, a faint hum echoed from behind a corner. Owen froze, instincts flaring as he reached for Laura's arm, pulling her into cover. They watched as two figures, cloaked in darkness, passed by, whispering in a language neither recognized. But the faint insignia on their suits was unmistakable. Human rebels, rogue operatives working against the Shalon Alliance. Laura's jaw tightened as she looked at him, betrayal flaring in her eyes. But Owen shook his head, pleading with his gaze. "They don't represent us, Laura. Let me prove it." She hesitated, but then nodded, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. They moved in tandem, edging closer to the rebels. Owen tapped her wrist, signaling their approach. In a synchronized burst of motion, they leapt from cover, disarming the operatives with swift efficiency. As the last operative fell, breathing hard and cuffed on the floor, Laura looked at Owen, her gaze fierce yet softened by trust. For the first time, she reached out, her hand briefly covering his. "You were right," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We are stronger together." Owen smiled, his own relief and admiration reflected in her eyes. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by the silence of a desolate outpost, they both realized the same truth, that their bond, fragile as it was, had already surpassed their world's cold suspicions. The outpost was silent now, the last of the rogue operatives subdued and locked away in the docking bay. Owen and Laura stood alone in the vast control room, surrounded by dim screens flickering with disrupted data streams, showing the quiet corridors they'd just cleared. A heavy, quiet tension settled between them. The mission was over, but both knew something lingered, something unspoken that neither could quite ignore. Laura turned to Owen, her gaze steady but carrying a softness he hadn't seen before. "You were right," she said, her voice barely a whisper in the dim light. "Not every human poses a threat. Some are far braver than I could have imagined." She held his gaze, her sapphire skin casting a faint glow in the low light, her usual guarded expression slipping just enough to reveal a glimmer of vulnerability. He smiled, his voice warm. "And you, Laura, are not the cold enigma I thought you were." She took a step closer, looking away for a moment as though gathering her words. "Back on Shala, my people will demand answers. They'll question how I could ever work with a human, let alone trust one." She shook her head, a hint of frustration flashing in her eyes. "I never wanted to believe I could trust you, Owen." Owen's smile faded. He knew what she was saying, and he understood it well. "You don't have to justify your loyalties to me, Laura. I know where I stand. But I also know," he paused, his voice softening as he reached out, hesitating before touching her hand. "I also know there's something here. Between us." She froze, looking down at his hand resting over hers, then up at his face. "There can't be anything between us. Not with our histories, not with our worlds on the brink of war over this very alliance. You understand that, don't you?" Owen's gaze was firm, yet there was a trace of sadness in his eyes. "I understand that I'm willing to try. That maybe there's something worth risking, something that could lead to peace if we let it. But it has to be a choice, Laura. Your choice." Her lips parted, the words caught in her throat. She wanted to deny it, to hold her vows as a Shalon diplomat closer than ever before. But here, in this isolated outpost with the silence pressing around them, all she could feel was the quiet, steady certainty that everything had changed. "It can't be," she whispered, though the conviction was gone. "We would be an anomaly, a foolish risk." Owen's hand tightened over hers, his voice a low murmur. "So let's be that anomaly. Let's show them that our differences don't have to divide us, that they can be the reason we grow." The words settled over her, carrying a weight she couldn't ignore. She took a step back, her gaze searching his face one last time, as if imprinting every detail into her memory. "Owen," she said, her voice unsteady. "If we choose this, if I choose this, it will change everything." He nodded, the warmth in his eyes steady, offering her a silent reassurance. "Then let it change everything." Slowly, Laura lifted her hand, brushing her fingers against his face, letting herself linger in that moment, one she'd never thought she'd allow. In that instant, the decision was made. Her heart thudded, her mind racing with 1,000 implications, but she couldn't deny the strength of what had taken root between them. Without another word, she leaned in, her lips brushing against his, soft and tentative, like the first gentle crack in an ice wall. He met her kiss with the same quiet intensity, a warmth that swept away the cold edges of their world's divides. But as they broke apart, a silent, understanding passed between them. They were standing on a thin bridge between their worlds, a bridge that could collapse at any moment. Yet in this fragile, stolen moment, it didn't matter. "Return with me to Shala," she whispered. "We'll go together. I'll find a way to make them understand." He nodded, a hint of disbelief in his expression, as if the weight of what she was offering had just struck him. "I'm with you, Laura. Whatever it takes." They walked out of the control room side by side, the quiet outpost now bearing witness to the promise they'd made. The journey ahead would be treacherous, filled with enemies and allies, resistance and change. But they would face it together. And as they boarded her ship, casting one last look at the vast, empty stars around them, Owen knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever challenges lay ahead, this choice, this impossible, forbidden bond, had redefined both of their worlds forever. The stars stretched before them, infinite and indifferent, as their ship slipped into the cosmos, bound for Shala and a future they would dare to shape together.